Good afternoon. Welcome to the Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 9 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll be taking up is related to universal basic income. As due to jobless growth, various countries have mooted the idea of universal basic income. The second article is related to separation of powers, as the Prime Minister Modi's visit to the house of CJI for Ganesh Puja has sparked a row. The third article is related to aviation sector, as India is going to become the aviation hub by the end of the decade. The fourth article is related to bulldozer justice and the rule of law, as the Supreme Court said that alleged involvement in crime cannot be a ground for destruction of property. The fifth article is related to Marxism. Additionally, we'll be taking up 4 prelim snippets as well. Now, the first article is related to universal basic income. The context behind it is that due to jobless growth, several countries have mooted the idea of a universal basic income. Now, we'll understand what is universal basic income, what are the arguments in favor of implementing it, what are the arguments against it, and what can be some practical ways to implement it. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development, etc. So what is a universal basic income? It is based upon the premise that in a just and a non-exploitative society, every individual should have access to a basic income, a minimum income on which he can rely, based upon which he can have access to the basic necessities of life, he can purchase the basic goods, and he can live a life with dignity. That is what a just society owes to any individual. So it is based upon the ideas of universality, unconditionality, and agency. That is, it should be universally available. Whether the person is rich or poor, the universal basic income should be given to all. It should be unconditional. There should not be any conditions imposed for the direct transfer, and it should be based upon agency. That is, it should be based upon choice. There should be no force on the individual. Now, what are the arguments in favor of implementing a universal basic income? One is that the subsidies which are given in kind by the government, they are inflicting an indignity upon the individual. Because if the government gives food, grains rather than cash, then you are assuming incapacity of the individual to take economic decisions himself, that is inflicting indignity. Plus, the subsidies in kind, they are administratively inefficient. That is, they will lead to ghost beneficiaries, leakages, etc. Even if they are controlled through implementation of Aadhaar, still there can be mistargeting. That is, there can be some inclusion errors and exclusion errors. Plus, the subsidies in kind are implemented through a multiplicity of schemes, including central sector schemes, centrally sponsored schemes, and their effectiveness is often questioned. Plus, there is a misallocation of resources often through subsidies in kind. For example, the economic survey data points out that the districts in India which account for 40% of the poor people in India, they get only 29% of the funding. Plus, there are some exclusion errors as well in the implementation of the subsidies in kind. And if we observe the implementation of Narega, there are still ghost workers. Plus, the implementation of UBI will ensure social justice. John Rawls' model of social justice is particularly applicable in the context of Indian society. That is, if we implement a universal basic income, it will ensure that at least the government's action is not leaving anyone worse off. And it will ensure a minimum living standard also, ensuring the dignity of life. The implementation of UBI will also ensure financial inclusion. Because if UBI is implemented, then there will be direct cash transfer through DBT. People will be brought into the banking sector. They will get access to formal credit also. They won't have to go to money lenders, the informal sector. Plus, it can contribute to the minimization of poverty and inequality in India. And it is unbecoming of a civilized society to allow any of its individuals to linger in poverty for perpetuity. There are other arguments in its favor also. For example, it may address the income uncertainty, which may come due to the impact of technology on jobs. Now is the era of AI, the artificial intelligence, which can further cause jobless growth. Now the impact of that can be lessened by implementing UBI. Plus the UBI can help the government garner support for implementing unpopular structural reforms. Whenever structural reforms are taken up, they cause short-term pain. Now that can be alleviating by giving universal basic income to everyone. Now there was a pilot study also which was conducted in Madhya Pradesh in 2011, and there were overall positive results due to the implementation of UBI. It led to widespread improvements in sanitation, child nutrition, school attendance, as well as the healthcare parameters including infant mortality, child mortality, etc. Because people had access to a universal basic income, therefore they were able to get the basic needs of life fulfilled. But there are certain arguments against universal basic income also. One school of thought says that it might cause a disincentivization to work. The labor may turn unproductive. It will become like a moral hazard, that the labor will become lazy. But this is only a minimal guarantee at best. It won't make sure that the people do not work at all. People won't be shirking work. Plus, the unconditionality may cause actually some protests, that regardless of contribution, you are providing everyone with some money, a basic minimum income. But as per Marx, even to everyone as per their needs and from everyone as per their capabilities. There is one school of thought which says that it will lead to a mismatch between rights and responsibilities. But it also acknowledges the non-wage related contributions. There are contributors who do not get any wages. For example, the household work which is done often by women. If they also get access to UBI, then their contributions are also acknowledged. That gender disparity may be induced by giving cash, but rather it can be viewed the other way around also. If women also get access to universal basic income, they will have cash in hand and it will rather promote gender equality. The fiscal cost is another cause of concern if UBI is implemented, as it may cause huge burden on the exchequer. But if it is becoming an add-on only, then it will be a burden. What if we implement it by giving a choice of replacement rather than choosing the subsidies in kind? Why don't you choose subsidy in cash? There is an adverse impact of political economy of universality. That is, if the government tries to implement universal basic income and transfers money to everyone, rich and poor alike, there may be protests, that there may be opposition that the government is transferring money to the rich people. Plus, there is the risk of market exposure. If the government starts giving cash rather than food, what if tomorrow the food prices rise? Then the people who are dependent upon subsidies for fulfilling their basic needs, even for example food, they will be subject to the volatility in the market. They will be subject to the market risk of the price fluctuations rather. Now, there is another thought that it may absolve the state of responsibilities. There are certain services which are not provided by the private sector. The private sector does not have the incentive to provide certain services which is provided by the state only. And if the state starts giving only universal basic income and starts withdrawing from all the other sectors, then it might lead to the state being absolved of the responsibilities. Plus, rather than giving them fish, why don't we teach them to fish? Why don't we go for skill development of the individuals? That will ensure that we have a skilled workforce also who is willing to contribute to the GDP growth of India. Plus, in Switzerland also the idea was implemented, but then it was withdrawn. Now, what can be some ideas to implement it? Rather than going for a de facto universality, we can go for de jure universality. That is, we can encourage people to give it up. That is, we can offer everyone universal basic income, but we can encourage the rich people to give it up. Or we can publish a list of the rich people also who are getting universal basic income. That is a kind of a negative motivation by naming and shaming the rich people and encouraging them again to give it up. Or we can define a negative list. We can define an exclusion criteria, that is, they are the non-deserving people who do not deserve access to the universal basic income. Or we can go for the approach of gradualism, that is, rather than implementing the universal basic income as an add-on, we can give a choice to the individuals who are getting access to the freebies, to the subsidies, for replacement rather than giving it additionally. Or we can implement it first for the women and the vulnerable groups. It will ensure that the multiplier effect also comes into picture, because if women get access to cash, it will lead to a multiplier effect. And also the yardstick for the assessment of the universal basic income should not be whether it is perfect or whether it is flawless. Rather, we should judge it based upon whether it will be improving the status quo substantially. Initially also we had tried to implement the universal basic income. For example, in 1938 a minimum income standard was discussed. In 1964 a plan was also there to start such a program. Then in 2011 and 12 two pilot projects were conducted in the state of Madhya Pradesh. In 2016-17 the economic survey suggested a scheme for the bottom 75% of the population while rolling back some of the subsidies. In 2022, again a party in Sikkim planned to roll it out. Not only in India, there have been experiments across the world. For example, in Kenya, there is a large experiment underway with villagers getting up to $1 per day. Brazil has run experiments. In Canada, there are plans to implement it. In France also, there was a recommendation for experimenting with UBI. In UK, Germany, across the Western nations also, there were plans to conduct experiments on the implementation of the universal basic income. Now there is a practice question also. Universal basic income has emerged as a significant policy proposal aimed at addressing poverty and economic inequality. Critically examine the arguments in favor of and against the implementation of UBI in India. Please try to write it. Now the next article is related to separation of powers. The context behind it is that Prime Minister Modi visited the house of the Chief Justice of India for Ganesh Puja, and it has sparked a row. There have been allegations that it has violated the doctrine of separation of powers, as alleged by senior advocate Indra Jaising also. Now we'll understand the concept of separation of powers and some issues related to it. This is important in GS2 under the topic separation of powers between various organs, dispute redressal mechanisms and institutions. So what is separation of powers? The power between various organs of the state is distributed. The legislature makes the laws, the executive implements the laws, and the judiciary interprets the laws. Now, the doctrine of separation of powers limits the possibility of arbitrary excesses which can be conducted by any of the organs of the state. For example, judiciary can impose checks upon the legislature. Likewise, legislature can also impose checks upon judiciary. For example, judiciary can strike down laws that are unconstitutional. In turn, the legislature can also pass legislations overriding the court decisions, and it can even impeach the judges. Likewise, there is a check and balance mechanism between the judiciary and the executive. The executive can pardon the people who are convicted by the courts, and the judiciary can strike down unconstitutional executive orders. There is a check and balance mechanism between legislature and executive also. The legislature can impeach the president, it can override the vetoes, and the executive in turn can veto the bills, or it can call for special sessions also. Now, how has this doctrine of separation of powers evolved? It was initially proposed by Montesquieu. Montesquieu, in his book Spirit of Laws, argued that the liberty is safeguarded by the separation of powers, that all the organs of the state, they should function within their own domains and they should not conduct arbitrary excesses. It was inserted in the US Constitution also, where the articles 1, 2, 3 define the powers for the legislature, executive and judiciary. In the Indian Constitution, there is no rigid separation of powers, but it is included under a directive principle under Article 50, which says that the state shall take steps to separate the judiciary from the executive in the public services of the state. Now, what are the provisions related to separation of powers in India? When we talk about the separation of powers between judiciary and executive, there is Article 50, which talks about the separation of judiciary from executive in public services. There are provisions in the Criminal Procedure Code 1973, and there is Article 361 also, as per which the president and governor, they enjoy certain immunities from the court proceedings. But there are certain overlaps also, there are functional overlaps. For example, under Article 72, the president enjoys certain judicial powers also, that is, it can grant pardon, remission, reprieve, etc. Under Article 323A and 323B, tribunals are established. The tribunals are quasi-judicial bodies, but the tribunals, they consist of members who come from both the judicial background as well as the executive background. Therefore, there is a functional overlap. And the district magistrates, they also perform certain judicial functions. For example, as returning officer, they scrutinize the applications of the candidates who are contesting polls, and they can reject their forms also. When we talk about the separation of powers between judiciary and legislature, there is separation enshrined under Article 121. As per Article 121, the conduct of a judge of High Court or Supreme Court cannot be discussed in the Parliament when the judge is acting in discharge of his official functions. Likewise, under Article 122, the court cannot inquire into the proceedings of the Parliament. But there is overlap between the functions of judiciary and legislature also. For example, under Article 61, the Parliament can impeach the President also. Therefore, the Parliament can perform judicial functions. Likewise, the judiciary often resorts to judicial activism and even overreach also. For example, it can resort to judicial legislation in case there is a legislative vacuum in that sphere. For example, it put in place Vishaka guidelines for the protection of sexual harassment at workplace. Likewise, in the case of People's Union for Democratic Republic versus Union of India, it also upheld the PIL, public interest litigation. There are certain case laws also which has helped evolve the doctrine of separation of powers in India. For example, in Ram Javaya Kapoor versus State of Punjab in 1955, the court observed that the principle of separation of powers is not recognized in India in absolute rigidity, but the functions have been sufficiently differentiated, the functions of the three organs of the state. In Golaknath versus State of Punjab 1967 case, the court observed that the three organs of the state, they are expected to exercise their functions within their limits, although certain encroachments are assigned by the constitution itself where they can perform the functions of the other. In Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan in 1975, the court observed that the separation of powers, this principle is part of the basic structure doctrine. In Kartar Singh versus State of Punjab case, the court observed that the functions of the three organs are well defined, that is, the legislature makes laws, the executive implements laws, and the judiciary interprets laws, and they should function within their own limits rather than encroaching upon the functions of the others. Now, what are the issues regarding the separation of powers in India? Sometimes the judiciary remains averse to the checks and balances which should be in place. For example, the judiciary struck down the 99th Constitutional Amendment Act, that is, it struck down the NJAC, National Judicial Appointments Commission, and still the collegium system is used for the appointments to the higher judiciary. The judiciary often overreaches also, it excesses its mandate, overrides its jurisdiction, and resorts to judicial legislation also at times. For example, still the collegium system is used for appointments and euthanasia. The judiciary legalized passive euthanasia in the Aruna Schonberg case. It also held that nota none of the above should be treated as a right of the people in the PUCL case. At the same time, there are excesses committed by the executive also. For example, there are allegations of over-centralization of power and the weakening of institutions. Therefore, ultimately, there should be a system of checks and balances, and the doctrine of separation of powers should be upheld. There is a practice question also. Analyze the concept of the separation of powers in India with specific reference to key case laws that have shaped its application. Please try to write it. The next article is related to aviation sector. The context behind it is that Prime Minister Modi has stated that India is going to become a leading aviation hub by the end of the decade. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, as well as in infrastructure, energy, ports, roads, airports, etc. So let's discuss first the status of the aviation sector in India. There are some green shoots. For example, in terms of market size, the Indian aviation market is supposed to surpass US and China also by 2030. In terms of connectivity, we have improved connectivity to the geographically far-flung areas including Northeast, and the aviation sector is set to grow more. It can promote tourism, which will further act like a growth pole for India, and it will work as a positive for the other industries also, the related industries. It will cause employment creation. For example, about 10,000 more pilots may be needed by 2030 in India as per a study. It will bring in more foreign direct investment into India. About $3 billion for the Noida's Jewar Airport and Navi Mumbai. It may provide a boost to the manufacturing sector in India also, for example, through the MRO operations, maintenance, repair and overhaul operations. For boosting the aviation sector, the government implemented the regional connectivity scheme also. Through the regional connectivity scheme, the total fares on the 1 hour long flights were capped to cost about 2,500. Also, the regional connectivity was promoted through the no frills airports based on lower levies, concessions, etc. Earlier, there used to be a requirement that for an airline to operate internationally, it should have an experience of at least 5 years of domestic operations, and it should have a fleet of at least 20 aircraft. Now that condition of 5 years of domestic flying experience before you fly internationally for an airline has been done away with. Now only the singular condition of 20 aircraft is remaining. And also the open skies policy promotes the liberalization in the sector and the open sky agreements with various countries. It has been proposed for the SAARC region and countries beyond 5,000 kilometers from Delhi. But the sector faces various challenges. For example, there is an infrastructure deficit. How? There is inadequate hangar space, and the land available which is required for the construction of more greenfield airports remains less. Plus, there are delays in the completion of various projects taken up for building of airports. Likewise, the fuel cost remains high. The cost of aviation turbine fuel in India is about 60% higher than the markets of ASEAN or the Middle East. Also, the ATF cost is also dependent upon the global oil costs. Therefore, it is again volatile. Also, the total fuel cost as a percentage of the operational cost for the airlines is about 45% in India. Globally, it is just about 30%. Therefore, ATF in India is quite costly. Also in the sector, there is a kind of a duopoly. As Indigo and Tata combined, they control more than 80% of the passenger segment in India. There are financial losses which are often faced by the airlines because they go for inflated financial projections. Then they have to file for bankruptcy. For example, the Kingfisher Airlines, the financial woes of SpiceJet, etc. There are grounded unsafe aircrafts also. A quarter of fleet is approximately grounded, and not only for unsafe regions, also for the delays in payments to the lessors. For example, in the case of SpiceJet also, some of their aircrafts have been grounded because of no payments to the lessors. There are operational issues as well. For example, there is shortage of the crew. The turnaround time in India in the aviation sector is higher than the turnaround time across the globe. The per capita penetration of the aviation sector in India remains low. There are policy barriers also. For example, entry barriers. Although one entry barrier has been removed, that for flying internationally, you don't need now 5 years of domestic flying experience for an airline. Also, the ATF prices, they remain a policy barrier. The rural connectivity remains low. Despite the implementation of the regional connectivity scheme, the Udan Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik, still the number of flights to the regional, rural areas, etc., it remains no. Now, the environmental impact also is a consideration. The CORSIA guidelines have to be adhered to and the carbon footprint has to be controlled. Now, what are some of the government initiatives and suggestions for this sector? One is the National Civil Aviation Policy 2016. It is to increase the footprint of the Indian aviation market globally and for increasing the implementation of the regional connectivity scheme, promoting the regional flights, etc. And through the Udan scheme, we are targeting more connectivity to the tier 2 and tier 3 cities. Through the open sky policy, open sky agreements have been signed with various countries. For example, we can operate unlimited number of flights from and towards USA. There are concessions in the form of tax. For the airport projects, there will be no taxes for 10 years. Also, there are no custom duties for the MRO operations, the maintenance, repair and overhaul. 100% FDI is allowed under the automatic route for the greenfield airport projects. The aircraft rules 1937 have been amended from time to time. For example, the commercial pilot license, it now need not be renewed every 5 years. The DGCA reforms have been taken up. Also, the government encourages Startup India for the aviation sector also. There is a practice question also. Discuss the key challenges facing the aviation sector in India and the various government initiatives undertaken to address these challenges. Please try to write it. The next article is related to bulldozer justice and the rule of law. The context behind it is that the Supreme Court has said that the alleged involvement in crime is no ground for the demolition of property. So we will understand the concept of rule of law and its applicability in India. This is important in GS2 under the topic Indian Constitution features significant provisions and basic structure. First, regarding the bulldozer justice, what are the concerns regarding this immediate justice mechanism? What are the concerns? It leads to a collective punishment. That is, not only the alleged perpetrator but also his innocent family members are punished because sometimes their houses are bulldozed. Therefore, the damage to property is not a punishment only for the accused but also for his family members and relatives. And it is a punishment without establishing guilt. The philosophy of Indian criminal jurisprudence is to assume innocence until proven guilty. But if the state bulldozes the property, then it is a kind of a punishment without the trial being finished, without the establishment of guilt. Also, it gives more discretion to the state, which can be done arbitrarily and at times it is questioned. This trend of abandoning the rule of law for the frontier justice, this is like the first step towards an authoritarian society. And if we encourage such a trend, it may erode the democratic norms. Therefore, the law should be allowed to take its own course and action should be taken only after the matter has been decided by the court. Now, coming to the concept of rule of law. Rule of law per se is not formally defined anywhere. It has evolved through time. Like Aristotle talked about the rule of reason. Then the eminent British jurist A.V. Dicey talked about the rule of law. His concept of rule of law is widely accepted. It is applied in India also, although there are certain exceptions. We will talk about them also. A.V. Dicey gives 3 points regarding the rule of law. He says that there should be a supremacy of law. It means that there should be no arbitrary powers given to the government. The law should be supreme. There cannot be any punishment to any individual without his crime being established. The punishment should be as per the law, and the exercise of the discretion has no place in case there is the supremacy of law. There can't be any discretion. If there is discretion, then it is the rule of man, and the rule of law does not allow any discretion. He says that there should be an equality before law. That is, everybody should be treated equally. There cannot be any special laws. There cannot be any special courts also. Every person should be subject to the same set of laws. Every person should go through the same court procedure also to get justice. Also, Dicey says that there should be a predominance of legal spirit. That is, not the written constitution, but it is ultimately the courts who are the ultimate protector of the rights, the human rights. And therefore, he is talking about the evolution of the reforms through the courts, the predominance of the legal spirit. When we look at it from the Indian context, we can see its application through Article 13. Article 13 talks about the term law. It says that the judiciary can strike down any law as unconstitutional if it violates any fundamental rights. Therefore, it provides for the provision of judicial review also implicitly. Likewise, in terms of the golden triangle, we can look at the rule of law. The golden triangle of rights, that is Article 14, 19 and 21, they also uphold the rule of law, because the rule of law talks about equality, the freedoms and liberty. Article 14 talks about the right to equality, Article 19 talks about the freedoms, and Article 21 talks about the right to life and personal liberty. And in E.P. Royappa versus State of Tamil Nadu case, the court had also observed that there can't be arbitrary discretion and there can't be arbitrary curtailment of the fundamental rights. It has to be tested on the touchstone of the golden triangle of 14, 19 and 21. There are certain exceptions also when we talk about the application of Dicey's concept in India. For example, there are discretionary powers which are given to the executive. Like the President and Governor, they have discretionary powers under Article 72 and 161. Under Article 72, the President can pardon, grant remission, reprieve, etc. The President can even prorogue the Parliament under Article 85. Likewise, the Governor can also grant remission, reprieve, etc. under Article 161. The Governor has even wider discretionary powers. Like the Governor can reserve the bills for the assent of the President under Article 200. The Governor can recommend the imposition of constitutional emergency in a state under Article 356. Likewise, there are certain immunities and privileges that they enjoy. The President and Governor, they enjoy immunity from court proceedings. There can't be any criminal proceedings instituted against the sitting President or Governor. For instituting the civil proceedings also, there has to be a notice which has to be given. There are privileges also, for example, diplomatic privileges which are enjoyed. Now, there are certain case laws also through which the rule of law has evolved in India. In Somraj versus State of Haryana case, the court had observed that even for the exercise of discretionary powers, there has to be a reasonable ground. They can't be exercised arbitrarily. For example, this was the case regarding appointments. The appointments of public servants, they are usually done on merit. Now these appointments, even if some discretion is allowed, there has to be some reasonable ground based upon which the discretion is exercised. It cannot be arbitrary altogether, because it will violate the first postulate of rule of law otherwise. In Keshavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala, the court observed that the rule of law is part of the basic structure of the constitution. It cannot be violated. In Indira Gandhi versus Raj Narayan case, the court observed that judicial review is also part of the law, part of the rule of the law. Here the court had struck down the 39th amendment to the constitution. It was regarding the election disputes, observing that even the election dispute related to the election of the prime minister is also not beyond judicial review, as judicial review is part of the rule of law. In D.K. Basu versus State of West Bengal, the court observed that the custodial violence is an assault on the human dignity. It is an assault on the rule of law also. In A.K. Kraipak versus Union of India, the court observed that principles of natural justice, they apply not only to judicial and quasi-judicial functions, they apply to administrative functions also. The principles of natural justice, for example, odi alteram partem, that is, both parties have to be heard before adjudicating a dispute, or nemo judex in causa sua, that is, no one can be a judge in his own case. They have to be adhered to while performing the executive administrative functions also. In ADM Jabalpur versus S. Shukla case, the court observed that the rule of law is antithesis of arbitrariness, and the rule of law is like an accepted norm in the civilized societies. Now, the next article is related to Marxism. Unfortunately, Sitaram Yechuri, the General Secretary of CPI, passed away. He was influenced by Marxism, so we will understand Marxism today. This is important in GS3 under the topic Contributions of Moral Thinkers and Philosophers from India and the World. Let's understand a few key terms first. The ideas related to Marxism existed even before Karl Marx also. Karl Marx called them utopian socialists. The utopian socialism correctly identifies the social ills in the society, that is, the exploitation, oppression, etc. But the remedies that utopian socialism proposes, they are utopian in nature, they are idealistic in nature. Rather, the approach of Karl Marx is scientific in nature. It is scientific socialism, where he gives the interpretation of history. The economic interpretation of history is given by dialectic materialism. We will understand that also. There are terms like evolutionary socialism and revolutionary socialism. The evolutionary socialism rejects violence as a tool for change. It tries to establish socialism through the choice of ballots, through peaceful means. It rejects violence. It tries to establish the socialism through parliamentary methods. The revolutionary socialism rather believes that the revolution is the midwife of social change, and therefore this revolution has to come, this revolution has to be violent, and there has to be a violent overthrow of the bourgeois, and subsequently there will be a dictatorship of the proletariat, that is the industrial working class. So Marx tries to explore this by dialectical materialism. Dialectics is an old methodology which proposes to expose the contradictions in the society to bring out the truth. That is, for example, Marx borrows from Hegel's dialectical triad. What does Hegel say? That there can be a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis to expose the contradictions in the society. The growth is done through this. That is, I propose an idea, you propose a counter to it, an antithesis. The two ideas, they are clashed together, the contradictions are exposed, and the falsehood is thus destroyed, and the truth is brought out. And then the thesis and antithesis bring out a synthesis. This synthesis over a period of time becomes thesis, and a counter idea again comes, an antithesis comes, both are again made to clash, and the falsehood is again exposed, and the truth remains. Ultimately, this happens over and over till the entire falsehood is destroyed and only the truth remains. So Marx uses this dialectical materialism as a methodology to propose the stages of class struggle. He proposes that in the ancient era, initially there was primitive communism, that is, in the age of hunters-gatherers. It was a classless, stateless, exploitationless society. The technology was in nascent stages. It used to be an age of hunters and gatherers, and there was no exploitation, no private property, etc. Then comes the age of slavery. As the technology develops, the production means change. As the means of production change, there is improvement in the productivity, improvement in production. When there is improvement in production, there is surplus production also. When there is surplus production, it leads to the building of a class. That is, there will be some people who will be owning property and some people who will be property less class. That is, essentially there will be some masters and some slaves. The property owning class will be the masters and the property less class will be the slaves. And whenever the slaves feel the resentment, that is, they feel that they are exploited by the masters, then the state comes to the rescue of the masters, as the state becomes an instrument of coercion at the hands of the masters. Now, as the technology further develops, the forces of production, they again change, and the age of slavery gives way to feudalism. In the feudalism, there are the feudal lords and there are the peasants. The feudal lords are owning the land and the peasants work on their lands. Therefore, the feudal lords, they can be considered like parasites who thrive on the labor of the peasants. Now, when the technology further develops, the capitalism emerges. In capitalism, again, there is a distance between the haves and the have-nots. That is, some people have private property, some people do not have. And again, there will be feelings of exploitation, resentment. There will be the development of the bourgeois and the proletariat class. The bourgeois will be the property owning class and the proletariat will be the industrial working class. This will be the distinction between the haves and the have-nots. And when there is so much resentment, then there will be a revolution from the side of the proletariat, the working class. And when there is a revolution, a violent revolution, it will lead to the overthrow of the bourgeois and establishment of a dictatorship by the proletariat, which will establish socialism after the dictatorship by the proletariat. Now, this socialism also Marx proposes that this is a transitory stage. Ultimately, it will lead to communism. In communism, there will be a perfectly stateless, classless, exploitationless society, whereby the state which was acting on the behest of the proletariat in socialism, this will also gradually wither away. There won't be any state also left at all, and the means of production, they will be owned by the community in toto. We can simply explain Marx through this diagram also that the capitalists, the bourgeois, they exploit the working class, the proletariat. There are imbalances in power, class conflicts, and there happens an economic and social revolution which overthrows the bourgeois, and the means of production, they are seized by the proletariat. Now, there are certain critics behind this approach also. One, Marx says that there are two divisions in the society, two classes, haves and the have-nots. But what about the middle class? There is a huge middle class in India also. And Marx predicted the narrowing of the capitalist class, but rather it has expanded. And he had also predicted the deterioration of the state of the proletariat, but it has not deteriorated to that extent. The capitalism has rather showed resilience. It is rather the socialist states which have collapsed. In the past, we have seen that. And Marx had predicted that the state in the socialist society will gradually wither away, because there will be establishment of communism, which will be a stateless, classless society. But what we have seen is state has become rather more powerful in the socialist countries also. Fukuyama, in the End of History book, says that it will be ultimately the capitalism which will triumph over socialism. But there are certain ideas of Marx which remain relevant. What is the relevance of Marxism? It can be used as a tool for social analysis. Also, it gives a voice to the voiceless. And a way of expression to the oppressed, the exploited class, and it can be treated as an alternative philosophy to liberalism. Now we'll be discussing 4 prelim snippets also. The first is related to Sanchi Stupa. Sanchi Stupa is located in Madhya Pradesh. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site also. It was built by Mauryan Emperor Ashoka in 3rd century BC. The religious relics or remains of Buddha are there, and not only of Buddha but also his most revered disciples. The structure of Sanchi Stupa consists of a stone railing. This stone railing is pierced by 4 gateways and they have elaborate carvings. We call them the Sanchi sculpture. It also has a hemispherical dome called the Anda, which symbolizes the dome of heaven enclosing earth. It is surmounted by a squared rail unit, that is Harmika. The Harmika represents the world mountain from which rises a mast, the Yashti, which symbolizes the cosmic axis. There are umbrellas, that is Chhatras, which represent the various heavens, that is Devlok. Now the next article is related to Standing Committee on Statistics. This was formed in 2019 as an internal oversight mechanism for official data. Now it has been dissolved. What is the need for it? Because it has been criticized by the members of Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. The head Bibek Debroy has also observed that the system needs to be overhauled and the Indian Statistical Service has little expertise in survey design. Now what are the terms of reference for this? It advises the center on survey methodology, including sampling frames, sampling design, survey instruments, questions, etc. It also provides for guidance for conducting pilot surveys, pre-testing, exploring the availability of administrative statistics relating to surveys, statistics, etc. It provides guidance for studying or identifying data gaps, providing additional data requirements and imparting technical guidance. Now a new steering committee has been formed. The new steering committee also has similar terms of reference, but it will have more official members. Now the next article is related to Commission for Scientific and Technical Terminology. The new Education Policy 2020 provided that education should be imparted in Indian languages for improved teaching learning outcomes. Now we are implementing technical education including engineering and medicine in Indian languages. For this, there is a creation of standardized scientific and technical terminology in the Indian languages, which is done by the Commission for Scientific and Technical Terminology. It publishes multilingual glossaries and definitional dictionaries and monographs. It also publishes 2 quarterly journals, that is Vigyan Garima Sindhu and Gyan Garima Sindhu. The next article is related to the Battle of Saragadi. It is considered as one of the finest last stands in the military history of the world. You can use it as an introduction for an essay. The Saragadi is a communication tower between Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan. It was located in the northwest frontier province, now in Pakistan. It was built by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. There 21 soldiers from the 36th Sikh Regiment fought against 8,000 Afridi and Orakzai tribals. They were led by Havildar Ishar Singh. Even today, the Khyber Scouts Regiment of Pakistan Army salutes that memorial. Thank you.